Welcome to Notes 3.1, The World in the 1930s, for Ms. Richardson, Mr. Culhane, and Mr. Baxter's U.S. History class. So, to understand World War II and how it started in Europe, we have to understand Europe in the 1930s. And so when we look at the economics and politics in Europe during this time period, while the U.S. was having a great time in the 20s and our economy was booming and things were fabulous for the U.S., that wasn't quite the case for Germany. In Germany and many other European countries, the Great Depression actually hit early. And if you remember when we talked about Germany, we talked about they went into a depression right after World War I. Think about the peace with the Great Depression, the peace with World War I, and how that peace agreement, the Treaty of Versailles that the U.S. never signed, punished Germany. And so they really sunk into a depression about 10 years before the U.S. did. So imagine the Great Depression twice as long. So that set the stage for people being ready for new leadership in their countries. When economic times are hard, people are ready for political change, there's a lot of political unrest, and there's a desire for new leadership. And into that, we have some new leaders who step up and promise change and promise that things will get better for people. And those leaders get a lot of power, and those are the ones that really make a difference and really lead us into World War II. So we're looking at dictators taking over in Europe because of the political and economic turmoil that the countries have been in for 10, 20 years at this point. So in Italy, the first of the dictators that I'll talk to you about, Benito Mussolini, or Il Duce, takes over Italy, and he is a leader of the fascist party. So here's Il Duce. He is a dictator who promotes fascism. Fascism, remember, is that aggressive nationalism. The country is the most important thing, your nation before anything else. And so that really promotes the country, not individualism. You're doing what's best for the country because that will help you be best. In addition to promoting fascism, Mussolini is also anti-communist. So he actually believes that that gives the working class more power, and so then the workers will rise up and overthrow the nation, and so that's actually a threat to fascism. And he took control of Italy in 1922 and set up a dictatorship. So the people welcomed him because he stopped the riots, he got people jobs, stopped strikes, so he made things better, and so people loved Mussolini when he took power. That doesn't stay that way. And by the end of the war, he's actually killed by his own people. But people, when he took power, loved Mussolini. And that's an important piece to remember. People really supported these dictators when they took over because their lives got better in the beginning. So our next dictator is Joseph Stalin. He was the dictator leader of the Soviet Union, or USSR. And he was communist. He promoted communism within the Soviet Union. He actually took over after Vladimir Lenin died. Lenin had taken over in the Russian Revolution. So back in World War I, remember the Russian Revolution was one of the reasons the U.S. joined, because there was no longer a king or emperor in charge of Russia. So Lenin took over. When Lenin died, Joseph Stalin took over in 1926. And not just of Russia, but the surrounding communist nations. The idea behind communism and communism in Russia under Stalin was you have one party, one political party, you suppress freedoms, you punish the opposition, and you have total control. So it's a totalitarian communist idea. And the communist piece is about the economy, and they have total control of the economy as well as the politics. Stalin really tried to begin industrialization in 1927, so that was really the first time Russia was becoming industrialized. And anybody who was opposed to his communist government, he actually sent them to work camps and prisons. So his industrialization was used prisoners to promote the industrialization. And really, in some ways, Stalin was worse than Hitler. He led to the death of between 8 and 12 million of his own people. So he didn't go out and try to take over other countries and punish people in other countries, but people that were seen as political prisoners in his country, between 8 and 12 million Russians were killed by Stalin during his reign. So again, ruling by fear and intimidation, but in the very beginning, they made things better, so they had support of the people. Our next dictator to look at is actually Adolf Hitler, who you probably have some background on here. He was also called the Führer. He was in charge of Germany through the Nazi Party, which is the National Socialist German Workers' Party. That's what Nazi stands for. Now, this Hitler was able to gain control and gain power because of the Treaty of Versailles, the end of World War I, and how the treatment of Germans, how Germans were treated at the end of World War I. And I told you a little bit about this at the end of World War I. So everyone else was trying to punish Germany, all the other European countries. They wanted them to pay all those reparations and things like that. And so there was really some negativity towards the rest of Europe, and Germany felt like they were being treated unfairly, and Hitler agreed with them and wanted to make things better for his country. Or at least that's how Hitler presented it in the beginning. He supported new political parties and ideas. He wanted to make things better. And originally, the Nazis tried to gain support in 1923 with an overthrow of the German government. So Hitler actually tried to violently overthrow the German government. Actually ended up in prison for that, where he wrote a book called Mein Kampf, which was my story, my struggle, and he explained what he was planning on doing, and then he got out of prison and did it. And he worked his way up through the Nazi Party, got them elected to positions of power and appointed to positions of power. Eventually, 10 years later, in 1933, they were the majority party in Germany. And he then used his military power, police groups, to get voted into power and gain absolute power in 1933 and 34. Now, people supported this. He was the majority party. In this time, while Hitler is using these tactics, he's also improving the economy. He's giving people jobs. Remember, we took away their military. He started it back up. We shut down their factories. He started them back up. He's giving people jobs. He's giving them this new party that is helping them. And so even though he's a Nazi dictator, and even though he did a lot of terrible things, he got elected into power because life in Germany was so bad. People were looking for a change, and he offered it to them. Then over time, he starts doing the things that are why we know him and why we still learn about him today. So things like the Holocaust and those didn't happen right away. He worked his way up to that. So the final group of dictators we want to talk about are in Japan, and they're actually a pair. Really, the one who has the power is General Tojo. He is the head general in the Imperial Army in Japan, and he really makes the decisions. Emperor Hirohito, our other leader here, is the political head, the religious and official head of Japan, but he has pretty much no actual governmental power. He has a civilian government. They can't make anyone do what they want. General Tojo, through his militarism, is able to really control the country. So it's really a military dictatorship, a militaristic government, and the military leads everything. So the military officers believed the government was responsible for the problems, so they actually assassinated the prime minister, and then they refused to listen to the civilian government. They created their own government under Tojo. They decided they were going to invade China and use them for resources, and that would fix their economic problems. So under the guidance of General Tojo, Japan actually invaded China in 1931 and became imperialistic and militaristic during the time period. So Japan is doing essentially the same thing that Germany is going to end up doing in Europe, in Asia, during the same time period. And so the two sides actually end up allied with one another. So all four of these groups of dictators were in your notes. You made a chart on these. So you should know about these guys and where they're from. And these men all rose to power really with a lot of popular support because life was so difficult for people in those countries. And this really upset many Americans. they were concerned that World War I had meant nothing. Remember, we were trying to get rid of dictators and give democratic governments. And so, even though we were upset, we didn't support a second war. We really turned towards isolationism and no foreign entanglements. We don't want to be involved in another war. Remember how things worked out with that last war. We were not so happy at the end of it. We really felt like it was a waste of time. A lot of people died, and so now we're feeling like we don't want to get involved again. So we remain isolationist, which was really our plan throughout the 20s and 30s. Americans support isolationism for a variety of reasons. Number one, to stay out of the war. We don't want to be involved. We also feel like European countries have not held up their end of the bargain. Remember those war debts? We talked about reparations. And how the U.S. was trying to help out. Well, they quit paying them in the 30s. So when we most needed the money, they quit paying because they didn't have the money to do it. And the U.S. is really questioning, a lot of Americans are questioning why the U.S. went to war in 1917. Was it really to do the right thing, or was it because it would help businesses and companies? So was it so they could make more money? And if that's why we went to war, why should we get involved again? And so people are really supporting isolationism and neutrality and staying out of the war in Europe. So based on the feelings of the majority of Americans during the time, Congress actually decides, okay, America wants neutrality, so we're going to legislate neutrality. And in the 1930s, we passed the Neutrality Act of 1935 and the Neutrality Act of 1937. We also have another one, the Neutrality Act of 1939, but that will come up again later, so I'll hold off on that one. 1935 Neutrality Act was really about making it illegal to sell any arms to any country that was at war. So they were saying that having arms, having military weapons, was one of the reasons for World War I. So let's not have that again. So they banned that. Neutrality Act of 1937 continued to ban the sale of arms, but it also said that non-military supplies required this cash and carry policy. So the country pays cash up front, no loans from us anymore, and they transport their own non-military supplies if they're at war. Congress was really trying to keep America out of the war, trying to make Americans happy by legislating neutrality and keeping us neutral. And so we see that during this time period. And hopefully you've been paying attention to these cartoons here. The style of these last couple cartoons should be very familiar, and if you look closely at the name of the artist on these cartoons, in the 1930s and 40s, a political cartoonist who went by the name of Dr. Seuss actually became quite popular. So we'll actually look at this when we look at propaganda again, but hopefully you notice the style and see that these cartoons were out there, and you can see some Dr. Seuss artwork that wasn't children's artwork. So now our dictators actually are going to make friends. So we've talked about Mussolini, we've talked about Hitler. In 1936, there was actually another dictator, Francisco Franco, who started a civil war in Spain. So his Spanish Civil War. Francisco Franco is backing the fascist party. He's the leader of the fascist party, and they are fighting against the Spanish government. Stalin backs the Spanish government, and here we see some pictures of Franco with his two backers, Hitler and Mussolini. So Franco is there on the left in the picture alone, and then you have Franco with Hitler and Mussolini and the others. And Hitler and Mussolini actually back Franco and his fascist party. They have a lot in common. He also becomes a dictator. They sign an agreement to cooperate on several different issues, and this creates an Axis power that Japan then joins later on. And so if you've heard of the Axis powers, that's really who we're talking about. There are three countries that become known as the Axis powers during World War II, and those are Germany, Italy, and Japan, all under, Nazi Germany, fascist Italy, imperialist Japan. And so those countries all have totalitarian governments that end up fighting against the Allied powers during World War II. So this where are we headed idea? Well, the leaders of the Axis countries, Italy, Germany, and Japan, had total control of their governments, total control of their countries leading into this. So they were totalitarian dictatorships. With this agreement that they have, it's really only a matter of time before they end up at war with another country. We know democratic nations are not going to be okay with this totalitarian, militaristic government, and so it's only a matter of time until we go to war. And these dictators become more and more aggressive, building up their militaries over time, and the rest of the world is really trying to avoid war. They're actually appeasing and trying to make things better, and it's only a matter of time, though, until you can't avoid the war anymore. And finally, eventually, both in Europe and in Asia, those other countries are unable to avoid the war, and we have the start of World War II. And so our next notes will cover the start of World War II.